Sign this." David handed Vanessa divorce papers at her mother's graveside. The casket was still being lowered. The priest was still praying. She was 7 months pregnant with his child. "Sign it now." His voice was cold, commanding. His mistress stood behind him, fake tears in her eyes. His parents watched, arms crossed, satisfied smiles. Vanessa's hand shook as she signed. Right there, at her mother's grave. She lost everything in that moment. But David made one fatal mistake. He had no idea who her mother really was. He had no idea what she'd left behind. And he had absolutely no idea what was coming for him. Before we dive in, we need to go back to how it all started. But first, make sure you subscribe to this channel and watch till the very end. Because what happens next? You wouldn't want to miss it. Now let's dive into the story. The cemetery was silent except for the sound of dirt hitting wood. Vanessa Reynolds stood at the edge of her mother's grave, her hand resting on her swollen belly, trying to breathe through the pain that had nothing to do with pregnancy. The Atlanta sky hung gray and heavy, matching the weight pressing down on her chest. Margaret Lawson was gone. The woman who raised her, protected her, loved her without conditions was now 6 feet under, and Vanessa had never felt more alone. Her husband, David, stood beside her, but he might as well have been a stranger. His hand was cold in hers, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on something beyond the casket being lowered into the earth. She squeezed his fingers, desperate for comfort, for connection, for anything that reminded her she wasn't completely abandoned. He pulled away. The pastor's voice droned on about ashes and dust, about God's mercy and eternal peace, but Vanessa heard none of it. She was watching David's hand slide into his jacket pocket, watching his jaw clench, watching him pull out a manila envelope that looked too official, too deliberate for a funeral. He turned to her, his face blank, his eyes empty of the warmth she once knew. "Vanessa." His voice cut through the pastor's prayer. She looked at him, confused, still holding on to hope that whatever was happening wasn't what her gut was screaming at her. He handed her the envelope. "What is this?" she whispered. "Divorce papers. I already signed them." The words hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back, her hand gripping the envelope as if it might explode. "What?" Her voice cracked. "David, what are you talking about?" He looked away, toward the line of black cars parked along the cemetery path. "It's over. This marriage. Us. It's better this way." Better this way? Her mother was being buried. She was carrying his child. And he thought now was the time to hand her divorce papers? "Are you serious right now?" Her voice rose, panic mixing with rage. "My mother just died. I'm pregnant with your baby. You're doing this here?" David's face twitched, a flicker of something that might have been guilt or might have been annoyance. "I know the timing isn't ideal, but waiting would only make it harder. You're strong, Vanessa. You'll figure it out." Strong. He was calling her strong while destroying her. She wanted to scream, to slap him, to ask him who he'd become, but the words stuck in her throat. Around them, mourners began to notice. Heads turned. Whispers started. The sacred moment of grief transformed into a spectacle. Vanessa felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their judgment, their pity, their curiosity about what she'd done to deserve this public humiliation. That's when she saw them. David's parents, Robert and Linda Reynolds, standing 30 feet away beneath a black umbrella that served no purpose since it wasn't raining. They weren't crying. They weren't mourning with her. They were watching, waiting. Linda's mouth curved into something that looked dangerously close to satisfaction. This wasn't spontaneous. This was planned, orchestrated. They had waited for her weakest moment and used her mother's funeral as the backdrop for her destruction. "Why?" Vanessa's voice came out hollow. "Why are you doing this?" David straightened his tie, avoiding her eyes. "Because I need you to understand that this is final. I'm with Claudia now. She's pregnant and she needs me." The name slammed into her like a truck. Claudia. His coworker. The woman whose texts lit up his phone at midnight. The woman Vanessa had asked about months ago, only to be told she was paranoid, insecure, imagining things. Claudia's pregnant? Vanessa's knees almost gave out. "You're leaving me, pregnant with your child, for another woman who's also pregnant with your child?" It's complicated. He shoved his hands into his pockets, like this was a business transaction. I don't expect you to understand, but Claudia makes me happy. She makes me feel alive. You. He paused, searching for words that would cut deepest. You make me feel trapped. Trapped. The word carved itself into her brain. 2 years of marriage, of building a life together, of creating a child together, reduced to one word. Trapped. Vanessa looked down at the divorce papers in her shaking hands, then at her belly, then at the fresh grave holding her mother. Everything she loved, everything she counted on, was either dead or walking away. The mourners were fully watching now, the pretense of respect abandoned in favor of front-row seats to her destruction. She could hear the whispers, feel the questions forming in their minds. What did she do wrong? Why would he leave her like this? Maybe she wasn't enough. Maybe she deserved it. You're making a mistake. Her voice came out steady, colder than she knew she was capable of. You have no idea what you're doing. David actually smiled. Not a kind smile. A pitying one. I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm choosing my happiness. Something you should try. He turned and walked away. No hug. No apology. No acknowledgement of the vows he broke or the life he was abandoning. He just walked back to his parents, who welcomed him with approving nods like he'd done something honorable. Vanessa stood frozen at her mother's graveside, divorce papers clutched in one hand, her other hand protecting her belly. The crowd began to disperse, uncomfortable with the scene they'd witnessed. Some offered hollow condolences that felt like insults. Others avoided her eyes completely, as if betrayal was contagious. She waited until everyone left, until the workers began shoveling dirt into the grave, until she was completely alone except for the ghost of her mother and the weight of her shattered life. She knelt in the dirt, not caring about her dress, not caring about anything except the unbearable pressure in her chest. I don't know what to do, Mom. Tears came hard and fast. He left me. Right here. Right now. At your funeral. How could anyone be that cruel? The wind picked up, rustling through the autumn leaves, and something shifted inside her. Grief mixed with rage. Humiliation mixed with determination. Her mother had taught her many things, but the most important was this. Never let them see you break. Whatever David and his family thought they'd accomplished today, whatever game Claudia thought she'd won, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Vanessa didn't know about the fortune yet. Didn't know about the $500 million her mother had hidden away, carefully structured to protect her from exactly this kind of betrayal. Didn't know that this absolute worst moment of her life was actually the setup for the greatest comeback anyone would ever witness. But she would find out. Soon. And when she did, David Reynolds would spend the rest of his life regretting every choice he made at that cemetery. Every cold word. Every calculated cruelty. Every moment he underestimated the woman carrying his child. He thought he'd buried her along with her mother. He had no idea he'd just awakened something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The days after the funeral blurred into a nightmare Vanessa couldn't wake up from. She sat in the house she'd shared with David, surrounded by his absence, staring at walls that suddenly felt like they were closing in. Every corner held a memory that now tasted like poison. The couch where they'd planned baby names. The kitchen where he'd kissed her forehead and promised forever. The bedroom where they'd created the life now growing inside her. All of it was a lie. The divorce papers sat on the coffee table, mocking her every time she walked past. She hadn't signed them yet, not because she thought there was hope, but because signing felt like agreeing that she deserved this. That somehow she'd failed. That David walking away at her mother's funeral was justified. Her phone buzzed constantly those first few days, but not with support. David's sister called to tell her she was making this harder than it needed to be by not signing immediately. His mother Linda sent a text that read, "David needs to move forward with his life. Stop being selfish." Selfish. She was 7 months pregnant, grieving her mother, and watching her marriage disintegrate. But she was the selfish one. The neighbors whispered when she checked the mail. Friends who used to invite her to brunch suddenly stopped responding to texts. The ones who did reach out came with questions disguised as concern. What happened between you two? Did you know about Claudia? Were there problems we didn't see? Each question felt like an accusation, like they were searching for proof that she'd caused this, that David's betrayal was somehow her fault. Social media became a minefield. David had been careful, strategic even, planting seeds of his narrative before handing her those papers. Posts about choosing happiness over settling. And sometimes the hardest decisions are the right ones flooded his page, each one liked and supported by people who had no idea what he'd actually done. Claudia played her role perfectly too. Pictures of her hand on her belly, captions about unexpected blessings, and finding love when you least expect it. The comment section was full of people congratulating them, celebrating their brave decision to follow their hearts. Nobody asked about the pregnant wife left behind at a funeral. Nobody cared about that story. Vanessa stopped looking at her phone, stopped answering the door, stopped pretending she was okay when she wasn't. She spent most days in her mother's study, the one room in the house that still felt safe, surrounded by Margaret's books and the faint smell of her perfume that somehow still lingered. It was there, on the 5th day after the funeral, that everything changed. She was looking for her mother's address book, thinking maybe there was anyone, who could help her figure out what to do next. The drawer stuck as she pulled it, and when she forced it open, something fell out from underneath. An envelope, cream-colored, sealed, with her name written in her mother's handwriting. Vanessa's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter and a small key. "My dearest Vanessa," the letter began, and just seeing her mother's words made her throat tighten. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I pray you never needed this letter. But knowing the world we live in, knowing the people who surround you, I prepared for the worst. In the safe deposit box at First Atlanta Bank, box 447, you'll find documents that will change everything. Accounts, properties, investments. I've spent 30 years building something that nobody knows about, and I built it for you. For moments like this. When people show you who they really are, believe them. Then use what I've given you to rise above them. Trust no one until they've earned it. Protect yourself and my grandchild. And remember, patience is the greatest weapon you'll ever have. I love you more than words can express. Show them what a Lawson woman is made of. Mom." Vanessa read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each word. Accounts? Properties? Her mother had worked as a bookkeeper for small businesses her whole life, lived modestly, never showed any signs of wealth. What was she talking about? She grabbed her keys and drove to the bank, the letter clutched in her hand, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. The safe deposit room was cold and private, and when the attendant left her alone with box 447, Vanessa's hands trembled so badly she could barely fit the key in the lock. Inside were folders, legal documents, account statements, property deeds, and numbers that made her head spin. $500 million. Her mother had accumulated $500 million across investments, real estate holdings, and business ventures Vanessa had never heard of. How was this possible? She pulled out document after document, each one revealing another layer of her mother's secret empire. Commercial properties across 3 states. Stakes in tech startups that had exploded in value. Carefully managed investment portfolios that had grown exponentially over decades. Margaret Lawson hadn't just been a bookkeeper. She'd been a genius, quietly building wealth while everyone around her assumed she was barely getting by. The documents were organized perfectly, each folder labeled with instructions, contact information for lawyers and financial advisors, and notes in her mother's handwriting explaining the strategy behind each investment. At the bottom of the box was another letter, shorter this time. "You're probably in shock. Good. Use that shock as fuel. These assets are structured to protect you completely. David has no claim to any of it. His family has no power here. Take your time. Learn everything. Then, when you're ready, show them exactly what they lost when they underestimated you." Vanessa sat in that cold bank room for 2 hours, absorbing the reality of what her mother had done. This wasn't just money. This was power. This was freedom. This was the ability to fight back against everyone who tried to crush her. She thought about David, probably with Claudia right now, celebrating his escape from the burden of their marriage. She thought about his parents, smugly believing they'd successfully removed her from their son's life. She thought about the neighbors whispering, the friends who'd abandoned her, the social media comments celebrating her destruction. They had no idea what was coming. Vanessa gathered every document, placed them carefully in her bag, and drove home with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. The grief was still there. The betrayal still burned. But underneath it all, something new was growing. Strategy. Purpose. The beginning of a plan that would turn every moment of humiliation into fuel for the most spectacular comeback they'd ever witness. That night, she finally looked at her phone. A text from David read, "Can you please just sign the papers? We both need to move on." She stared at it for a long moment, then typed back for words. "You have no idea." She didn't elaborate, didn't explain. Just let those words sit there, a promise, and a warning wrapped into one message that would haunt him soon enough. Vanessa placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick strong and steady. "Your grandmother left us something incredible," she whispered. "And we're going to use it to teach some people a lesson they'll never forget." The game had changed. David thought he'd won by walking away. Claudia thought she'd stolen the prize. The Reynolds family thought they'd eliminated a problem. But they'd actually just created their worst nightmare. A woman with nothing to lose, everything to gain, and the resources to make sure justice wasn't just served, but delivered with perfect, devastating precision. Vanessa spent the next week locked in her mother's study, surrounded by documents that rewrote everything she thought she knew about Margaret Lawson. The woman who'd clipped coupons and bought store-brand groceries had been playing chess, while everyone else was playing checkers. Every property deed told a story. Every investment statement revealed a calculated move. Her mother hadn't just saved money. She'd built an empire so quietly that not even her own daughter had suspected. The portfolio was staggering in its scope and sophistication. Commercial real estate in Atlanta, Charlotte, and Miami. A 12% stake in a tech company that had gone public 5 years ago and tripled in value. Municipal bonds. Blue chip stocks. Private equity investments in startups that most people had never heard of but were now worth millions. Margaret had diversified across industries, across markets, across risk levels, with the precision of someone who'd studied every angle and anticipated every outcome. Vanessa found herself talking to her mother's ghost as she went through each file. "How did you do this? How did you hide this from everyone?" Then she'd find another note in Margaret's handwriting, and it was like her mother was answering. One note tucked into a folder about the Miami properties read, "People see what they expect to see. I let them see a simple bookkeeper. They never look deeper." Another note, attached to documents about a private investment fund, said, "The best protection is being underestimated. Let them think you're small. Then strike when they least expect it." Her mother had known that people would try to use Vanessa, manipulate her, betray her. She'd built this fortune not just as inheritance, but as armor, as weapons, as tools for the war Vanessa didn't even know she'd be fighting. The phone number at the bottom of her mother's instruction letter connected her to James Morrison, a lawyer who'd been managing Margaret's legal affairs for 20 years. They met at his downtown office, a sleek space on the 40th floor with views that stretched across Atlanta. James was in his 60s, sharp-eyed and direct, with a kind of calm authority that came from decades of protecting powerful people. "Your mother was one of the most brilliant clients I've ever had," he said, settling into his chair across from Vanessa. "She started with almost nothing and built something most people couldn't build with 10 times the starting capital." Vanessa leaned forward. "Why didn't she tell me? Why keep a secret?" James smiled slightly. "Because she was protecting you. If David or his family had known about this wealth, do you think they would have waited until after her death to make their move? They would have tried to control you years ago." The words hit hard because they were true. If the Reynolds family had known about $500 million, they would have sunk their claws in deep, making sure David stayed married to secure access to it. Margaret structured everything specifically to keep you protected. James continued, pulling out another set of documents. Every asset is in trust with you as the sole beneficiary. David has zero claim to any of it, even though you were married when she passed. The prenup you signed before your wedding, the one his parents insisted on, that works in your favor now. It clearly states that inheritance and family assets remain separate. Vanessa remembered that prenup, remembered how Linda Reynolds had pushed it, claiming it was standard procedure for their family. They'd been so focused on protecting David's modest trust fund that they'd accidentally protected Vanessa's massive inheritance. What can I do with all this? Vanessa asked, her hand resting on her belly. I mean practically. What are my options? James pulled up a presentation on his computer screen. You can do whatever you want. These assets generate approximately $2.3 million monthly in passive income. The properties are managed by professional firms. The investments are diversified enough that market swings won't destroy you. Your mother built this to be self-sustaining. $2.3 million a month. Vanessa's mind struggled to process it. She'd been worried about how she'd afford diapers and daycare as a single mother, and now she was learning she'd never have to worry about money again. But here's what I think you're really asking, James said, his tone shifting. You want to know if you can use this to fight back, to make the people who hurt you face consequences. Vanessa met his eyes. Can I? James smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for this question. Your mother anticipated that too. She left very specific instructions about what to do if you were ever betrayed or abandoned. She called it her justice protocol. He pulled out another folder. This one marked with Vanessa's name and the word emergency in red ink. Inside were strategies, contact lists, and step-by-step plans for various scenarios. Margaret had literally written a playbook for her daughter's revenge. She thought of everything, Vanessa whispered, reading through the notes. Everything. James nodded. She knew people, knew how they operated, knew that kindness was often mistaken for weakness. So she made sure you'd have the tools to correct that mistake when the time came. Over the next hour, James walked Vanessa through the structure of her inheritance, explaining how each piece could be leveraged, how the wealth could be revealed or hidden depending on her strategy, how the legal protections her mother had built would keep David and his family from ever touching a cent. There's one more thing, James said as their meeting was wrapping up. Your mother set up a charitable foundation in your name. It's currently dormant, but it's structured and ready to activate whenever you choose. She believed that real power wasn't just about having money. It was about being seen as someone who uses it well. The foundation documents showed a $50 million endowment, ready to be deployed for causes Vanessa cared about. Education, women's shelters, children's hospitals. Her mother had even included suggestions for board members, people from her network who would help Vanessa build a public reputation as a philanthropist. Vanessa left James Morrison's office with a briefcase full of documents and a mind full of possibilities. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, just breathing, processing, planning. David thought he'd left her with nothing. He had no idea he'd walked away from a woman who could buy his parents' house with pocket change. Claudia thought she'd won by stealing him away. She didn't know she'd claimed a prize that was about to become worthless. The Reynolds family thought they'd successfully removed a problem from their lives. They'd actually just created an enemy with unlimited resources and nothing to lose. Vanessa's phone buzzed. Another text from David. Vanessa, this is getting ridiculous. Just sign the papers so we can both move on with our lives. She stared at the message, then at the briefcase beside her filled with proof of a fortune he couldn't imagine. She typed back slowly, carefully, each word chosen for maximum impact. I'll sign when I'm ready. Until then, enjoy your new life. I know I'm about to enjoy mine. She hit send and started the car. There was so much work to do. Financial advisors to meet, properties to visit, investments to review, a strategy to build that would turn her mother's foresight into the most spectacular reversal of Fortune Atlanta had ever witnessed. But first, she needed to go home and rest. The baby was kicking, reminding her that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about building a future where her child would grow up knowing that being underestimated was a gift, that patience was power, and that justice, when it finally arrived, was always worth the wait. Vanessa drove home with the windows down, breathing in the cool evening air, feeling something she hadn't felt since the funeral. Hope. Not the naive hope of someone who believed everything would be okay. The fierce, determined hope of someone who knew exactly how to make everything okay, and had the resources to do it. David had made his choice at that cemetery. Now Vanessa was about to make hers, and hers would echo for years. Claudia Bennett had always been good at playing roles. In high school, she'd been the girl who befriended the popular kids just to learn their secrets. In college, she'd dated the professor's son to secure better grades. At work, she'd positioned herself near David Reynolds the moment she noticed his wife rarely came to office events. She saw opportunity where others saw boundaries, and David had been the easiest mark she'd ever targeted. The pregnancy lie had been her masterpiece. A few carefully timed photos of her hand on her flat stomach, some morning sickness complaints at the office, a fake ultrasound image she'd pulled from a Google search and edited with her own name. David had believed every word because he'd wanted to believe. Men like him always did. They wanted to feel needed, wanted chosen. Claudia had simply given him the story he was desperate to hear. She sat in David's apartment now, the same apartment he'd moved into 3 days after handing Vanessa those divorce papers. It was temporary, he'd said, just until the divorce was finalized and he could figure out his next move. Claudia didn't care about temporary. She cared about security, about locking him down before he realized what he'd actually given up. "Baby, can you grab my prenatal vitamins?" she called from the couch, her hand dramatically pressed to her forehead. David emerged from the kitchen with a glass of water and the bottle of regular multivitamins she'd relabeled. "You feeling okay?" His voice carried genuine concern, the same concern he'd probably once shown Vanessa before Claudia had poisoned it. "Just tired. The baby's taking a lot out of me." She took the vitamin, swallowed it with theatrical effort, and leaned into him. "I'm so glad I have you. I don't know how I'd do this alone." David wrapped his arm around her, and Claudia felt the satisfaction of a plan coming together. He'd left his pregnant wife for her pregnant self, which meant he was locked in by guilt, obligation, and the narrative he'd created to justify his choices. He couldn't back out now, without looking like a monster twice over. But maintaining the lie was getting harder. His mother Linda had started asking about doctor's appointments. His sister wanted to throw a baby shower. Claudia had been deflecting, claiming her doctor preferred privacy, that she was superstitious about celebrating too early, that she'd had a scare and wanted to wait until the second trimester was over. Each excuse bought her time, but time was running out. She was supposedly 4 months pregnant now, and soon people would expect a visible bump she couldn't fake. "I was thinking," David said, breaking into her thoughts, "maybe we should go to your next appointment together. I want to be involved, hear the heartbeat, see the ultrasound. Be there for all of it." Claudia's stomach dropped, but her face remained calm. "That's sweet, baby, but my doctor has this weird policy about partners at appointments during the first trimester complications. She says it creates too much stress." David frowned. "You're almost out of the first trimester though, right? When does that policy end?" "Soon," Claudia said quickly. "Very soon. I promise you'll be at every appointment after that." She kissed him before he could ask more questions, using physical distraction the way she always did when conversations got dangerous. It worked. It always worked with David. He was so easy to manipulate that sometimes Claudia wondered if he'd always been this weak or if she'd just gotten that good. What Claudia didn't know was that David's doubts were growing in ways even he didn't fully recognize yet. Small things. The way Claudia never actually looked pregnant despite claiming to be 4 months along. The way she avoided his family. The way her stories about doctor's appointments changed slightly each time she told them. He'd pushed these observations away, labeled them as paranoia, told himself he was just feeling guilty about Vanessa. But the doubt was there, quiet and persistent, eating away at the foundation of everything he'd burned his life down to build. At work, people had started treating David differently. The story of him serving divorce papers at a funeral had spread despite his efforts to control the narrative. Co-workers who used to respect him now gave him cold shoulders. His boss had pulled him aside to say the company preferred to avoid personal drama that reflected poorly on the firm. Even Claudia's co-workers had started whispering, though David didn't know what they were saying. Meanwhile, Vanessa had become a ghost he couldn't escape. He'd see her car around town and feel his chest tighten. He'd get her brief text responses to his demands about signing the papers, and the calm coldness of her words unsettled him more than tears ever could. She wasn't falling apart like he'd expected. She wasn't begging him to come back. She was just existing somewhere beyond his reach, and it made him feel like he was missing something crucial. "What are you thinking about?" Claudia asked, noticing his distance. "Nothing. Just work stuff." He stood up, suddenly needing space from her, even though he didn't understand why. "I'm going to take a walk." Outside, the evening air felt heavy. David walked through his new neighborhood, so different from the home he'd shared with Vanessa, and felt the weight of his choices pressing down. He'd destroyed his marriage for this. For Claudia. For the promise of a baby and a fresh start. But what if it was all wrong? What if he'd made a mistake that couldn't be fixed? His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "Linda, we need to talk about Vanessa. Call me." He called, dreading whatever lecture was coming. "What's going on? Have you noticed anything strange about Vanessa lately?" Linda's voice was sharp with something David couldn't identify. Concern? Fear? "What do you mean strange?" She was at the mayor's charity luncheon today, sitting at a VIP table, wearing clothes that cost more than your car, talking to people we've been trying to get meetings with for years. David's mind went blank. That's impossible. Vanessa doesn't know those people. She can't afford those clothes. You must have seen someone who looked like her. It was her, David. I saw her up close. She saw me too, and she smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile that says she knows something we don't. David hung up and immediately searched social media for anything about the luncheon. There, tagged in multiple photos, was Vanessa. Hi, Vanessa. Except she didn't look like him anymore. She looked powerful. Confidence. She was glowing despite being 8 months pregnant, wearing a dress that probably cost thousands, surrounded by Atlanta's elite like she'd always belonged there. How was this possible? Her mother had been a bookkeeper. Vanessa had worked part-time at a nonprofit. They'd always struggled with money, always worried about bills. Where was this coming from? David. Claudia's voice came from the doorway. You've been out here for 20 minutes. Come back inside. He turned to look at her, really look at her, and for the first time since this whole thing started, he saw her clearly. The way she positioned herself. The way she performed vulnerability. The way she never actually showed him proof of anything she claimed. The pregnancy test she'd shown him could have been anyone's. The ultrasound could have been downloaded from the internet. He'd never actually gone to a doctor's appointment. Never actually heard a heartbeat. Never actually seen proof beyond her word. Claudia, I want to go to your next doctor's appointment. His voice was firm now. No excuses. No policies. I'm coming with you. Her face flickered just for a second, but he saw it. Panic. Baby, I told you, I don't care what you told me. I'm coming. If you're really pregnant with my child, there's no reason for me to not be there. Claudia's jaw tightened. Fine. I'll schedule something and let you know. But they both knew she wouldn't. They both knew the game had just shifted. David walked past her back into the apartment, his mind racing with questions he should have asked months ago. What had he actually given up? What had he actually gained? And why did Vanessa, the woman he destroyed at her mother's funeral, suddenly look like she'd won something he didn't even know they were competing for? The trap Claudia had set was starting to close, but not around David. Around her. And she had no idea that Vanessa wasn't just wealthy now. She was strategic, patient, and gathering evidence of every lie that had been told, every manipulation that had been performed, every betrayal that would soon be exposed in the most public, devastating way possible. Vanessa moved into her mother's estate on a Tuesday morning, 8 months pregnant, and more focused than she'd ever been in her life. The house wasn't the modest 3-bedroom she'd grown up in, that had been sold years ago. Margaret had told her to downsize after Vanessa went to college. What a lie that had been. The real estate sat 20 minutes outside Atlanta, hidden behind gates and old oak trees, a sprawling property that Margaret had purchased under a trust name nobody would connect to her. 6 bedrooms, a library that smelled like leather and old money, windows that overlooked gardens Vanessa didn't even know her mother owned. This was where Margaret had really lived, where she'd planned and strategized and built an empire while everyone thought she was clipping coupons in a small apartment. Vanessa walked through rooms filled with her mother's presence, touching furniture that cost more than most people's cars, and felt the full weight of the inheritance settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just money. This was responsibility, legacy, the obligation to use what her mother built to protect herself and destroy anyone who thought they could use her. She met with Catherine Jo the next day, a financial advisor whose name had been at the top of Margaret's contact list with 3 stars next to it. Catherine's office was in Buckhead, glass and steel, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from managing billions. She was younger than Vanessa expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that seemed to calculate everything before she spoke. "Your mother was extraordinary," Catherine said, pulling up files on her computer. "Most of my clients inherit wealth. Margaret created from almost nothing. Do you understand how rare that is?" Vanessa shifted in her chair, her hand resting on her belly. "I'm starting to." Catherine smiled. "Good. Because now we need to talk about what you want to do with it. Your mother's strategy was defense and growth. She built walls around her assets, made sure they multiplied, and stayed invisible. But you're in a different position. You've been attacked. So the question is, do you want to stay invisible, or do you want them to see what they lost?" The question hung in the air between them. Vanessa thought about David at that cemetery, about Claudia's fake sympathy, about Linda Reynolds' satisfied smile as her son handed over divorce papers. She thought about the whispers, the judgment, the way everyone had assumed she was weak and defeated. "I want them to see," Vanessa said quietly. "I want them to understand exactly what they threw away." Catherine's smile widened. "Then let's build you a public presence that makes that impossible to miss." Over the next 3 hours, they mapped out a strategy that was equal parts business and psychological warfare. Vanessa would start appearing at charity events, the kind where Atlanta's elite gathered to see and be seen. She'd join boards of organizations that mattered, show up in society pages, position herself as a philanthropist and businesswoman emerging from grief. Every appearance would be calculated to reach David's social circle, to make him hear whispers about his ex-wife's mysterious wealth, to plant seeds of doubt about every choice he'd made. "We'll also activate your mother's foundation," Catherine said, pulling up documents. $50 million to start, focused on causes that will get media attention. Women's shelters, children's hospitals, education programs for underprivileged kids. You'll be seen as someone who uses wealth to help people, which makes you untouchable when the truth about David and Claudia comes out. Vanessa leaned forward. "What truth are we talking about?" Catherine's expression turned cold. "The truth is that he abandoned his pregnant wife at her mother's funeral. The truth is that Claudia's pregnancy is fake. The truth that his family coerced him into a divorce. All of it. But we don't just tell people. We let them discover it. We create situations where the evidence reveals itself." She pulled out a folder Vanessa hadn't seen before. "Your mother hired a private investigator 6 months before she died. She suspected something was wrong with David, with Claudia, with the whole situation. This folder contains everything he found." Vanessa opened it with shaking hands. Inside were photos of David and Claudia together, timestamps showing their affair had started 9 months ago. Not for like they claimed. Text messages between Claudia and a friend where she admitted the pregnancy was fake, called it her insurance policy to lock David down. Emails between David's parents discussing how to pressure him into divorcing Vanessa. Bank statements showing Linda Reynolds had paid Claudia $10,000 3 weeks before the funeral. Her mother had known, had documented everything, had prepared Vanessa to fight back with evidence that couldn't be disputed or dismissed. "My mother knew all of this and never told me?" Vanessa's voice cracked. Catherine's expression softened slightly. "She was dying, Vanessa. She didn't want to spend her last months watching you suffer through a divorce. She wanted to give you the tools to handle it yourself, to come out stronger. And she did. Vanessa closed the folder, her mind racing. What do we do with this? Nothing. Yet. Catherine stood, walking to the window, overlooking Atlanta's skyline. Right now, David thinks he got away with it. Claudia thinks her plan worked. Your in-laws think they successfully removed you from their lives. Let them enjoy that feeling. Let them get comfortable. Because the higher they feel, the harder they'll fall when we pull the floor out from under them. Over the next 2 months, Vanessa executed Catherine's strategy with precision that would have made her mother proud. She attended a fundraiser for the Atlanta Children's Hospital, donating $500,000 and making sure the donation was very public. She joined the board of a women's shelter, bringing both her money and her story of surviving betrayal, though she kept the details vague enough to create mystery. She showed up at gallery openings, charity auctions, and society luncheons, always dressed impeccably, always calm and gracious, always visibly pregnant and radiating strength that made people curious about her story. The whispers started exactly as Catherine predicted. That's David Reynolds' ex-wife. I heard he left her at a funeral. Where did she get that kind of money? She's Margaret Lawson's daughter? I had no idea Margaret had money. She carries herself like old money, doesn't she? Each appearance was photographed, tagged on social media, written about in the society sections of local papers and blogs. Vanessa became impossible to ignore, and every mention of her included context about her recent divorce, her pregnancy, her mother's death. The narrative David had tried to control was slipping through his fingers, replaced by a new story where Vanessa wasn't the villain or the victim, but something far more dangerous, the mystery. David's mother called Vanessa twice, both times going to voicemail. His sister sent a Facebook message asking if they could talk about some confusion regarding the divorce. Vanessa ignored them all, letting silence do more damage than any conversation could. She spent evenings in her mother's library, reading Margaret's journals, understanding the philosophy behind every decision. Her mother had written extensively about patience, about letting enemies defeat themselves, about the power of being underestimated. People reveal their true nature when they think you're powerless. One entry read, "Give them enough rope and they'll hang themselves with it. Your only job is to document the process." Vanessa was documenting everything. Every social media post Claudia made about her fake pregnancy. Every time David's story changed slightly. Every interaction with the Reynolds family. She kept recordings, screenshots, timestamps, building a case that would be undeniable when the moment came to present it. Her lawyer James Morrison called weekly with updates. The divorce papers still sat and signed because Vanessa was strategically delaying, using legal procedures and technicalities to stretch the process while she built her position. David was getting frustrated, which was exactly what she wanted. "He's threatening to take you to court to force the divorce through," James said during one call. "Let him," Vanessa replied calmly. "A court proceeding means public records, discovery, testimony under oath. Is that really what he wants?" James chuckled. "I'll make sure his lawyer understands that. I suspect the threats will stop." They did. Within days, David's aggressive demands softened to requests, then to almost pleading messages about just wanting to move forward. But Vanessa wasn't ready for him to move forward. She was building towards something specific, something her mother had planned for, something that would expose every lie and betrayal in the most public, undeniable way possible. The baby kicked hard, reminding her that time was running out. She was due in 3 weeks, and she wanted everything in place before then. The final pieces were coming together. The gala was being planned. The evidence was compiled. The witnesses were prepared. All that remained was patience, the same patience her mother had taught her, the patience that separated those who reacted from those who won. The charity luncheon at the Ritz-Carlton was packed with Atlanta's power players, the kind of event where business deals happened over salmon and donations were made for social positioning as much as goodness. Vanessa arrived 30 minutes late, a strategic choice Catherine had insisted on. "Let them settle in, start talking, get comfortable," she'd said. "Then you walk in and stop every conversation in the room." It worked exactly as planned. Vanessa entered wearing a navy dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, her pregnant silhouette impossible to miss, her composure radiating the kind of quiet authority that made people sit up straighter. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. She felt the weight of recognition ripple through the room as people realized who she was and started putting together pieces of the story they'd been hearing in whispers. Linda Reynolds was there, seated at a table near the back with 3 women from her country club. Vanessa watched her mother-in-law's face drain of color, watched her lean over to whisper urgently to her companions, watched the panic set in as she realized the woman she tried to erase was not only present, but elevated beyond anything the Reynolds family could claim. Vanessa didn't acknowledge her, didn't even glance in her direction. She simply walked to her assigned table near the front, a VIP section reserved for major donors, and took her seat beside Marcus Jen, a tech entrepreneur whose company her mother had invested in years ago. Vanessa Lawson, Marcus said warmly, standing to greet her. Your mother was one of the smartest investors I ever met. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Vanessa replied, settling into her chair with the careful movements of someone very pregnant. She spoke highly of you too. Said you were one of the few people in tech who understood that ethics and profit weren't opposites. Their conversation flowed easily, and within minutes, other people at the table were leaning in, asking about her mother's investment strategies, about the foundation she was starting, about her plans now that she was managing such significant assets. Vanessa answered each question with practiced grace, never bragging, never oversharing, but making it clear through careful words that she was not someone to be dismissed or pitted. She was a force. Across the room, Linda Reynolds was on her phone, almost certainly calling David, probably describing this impossible scene where his abandoned ex-wife sat among people his family had been trying to impress for years. The mayor stopped by Vanessa's table to thank her personally for her recent donation to the Children's Hospital. A state senator introduced himself and asked if she'd be interested in joining a committee on education reform. A journalist from the Atlanta Business Chronicle requested an interview about women in finance. Each interaction was witnessed by dozens of people, including Linda, and each one drove home the same message. Vanessa Lawson was not defeated. She was ascending. When the luncheon ended, Vanessa made her way slowly toward the exit, stopping to chat with several people who approached her. She saw Linda intercept her path, and for a moment considered simply walking past. But that would look weak, like she was avoiding confrontation. So she stopped and waited, her face neutral, her body language relaxed despite the tension coiling in her stomach. Vanessa, Linda's voice was tight, controlled, like she was speaking to a child who'd misbehaved. We need to talk. Hello, Linda. How are you? Vanessa's tone was pleasant, almost warm, which clearly threw her mother-in-law off balance. I'm confused. Very confused. What are you doing here? How did you get a seat at the VIP table? Where did that dress come from? Linda's eyes scanned her up and down, searching for answers that made sense. I was invited because I'm a donor. The dress is just a dress. Is there something specific you wanted to discuss? Vanessa kept her voice calm, refusing to give Linda the reaction she was fishing for. Linda stepped closer, lowering her voice. David told me your mother was a bookkeeper, that you've been living on his income. So where is all this coming from? The donations, the clothes, the sudden appearance at events like this. Vanessa smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. My mother was many things Linda didn't share with people who didn't need to know. Turns out she taught me the same skill. She let that sink in for a moment before continuing. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another appointment. It was lovely seeing you. She walked away before Linda could respond, feeling the satisfaction of leaving her mother-in-law speechless and scrambling for answers she'd never get until Vanessa was ready to give them. That evening, David called. Vanessa let it go to voicemail 3 times before finally answering on the 4th attempt. What do you want, David? Her voice was tired but not weak, exhausted but not broken. My mother said she saw you today, at some charity thing. She said you were sitting with the mayor and wearing designer clothes and acting like some kind of socialite. He sounded angry, confused, like her existence outside of his narrative was a personal offense. I attended a luncheon. Is that a problem? Where are you getting the money for this, Vanessa? For the donations people are talking about? For the lifestyle you're suddenly living? Did you take out loans? Because if you're going into debt to make some kind of point, I'm not in debt, David. I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. Is there anything else? The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Vanessa almost hung up. Who was your mother, really? His voice was quieter now, uncertain in a way she'd never heard before. Because I'm hearing things that don't make sense. People saying she was connected to businesses, investments, property deals. But that's impossible. She worked as a bookkeeper for small companies. She lived in that tiny apartment. She drove a 15-year-old car. My mother was exactly who she needed to be in every situation, Vanessa said carefully. She taught me that the best protection is being underestimated. Looks like she was right. What does that mean? It means you made assumptions about who I was, who my family was, what I was worth. And those assumptions were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Anything else? David's breathing was heavy on the line. Are you trying to get back at me? Is this some kind of revenge? Vanessa laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Revenge would require me to care what you think, David. I'm just living my life. The life my mother prepared me for. The life I would have been living all along if she told me the truth sooner. Vanessa, I don't. Her voice cut sharp. Whatever you're about to say, don't. You made your choice at my mother's funeral. You handed me divorce papers while they lowered her into the ground. You chose Claudia and her convenient pregnancy over your actual pregnant wife. You chose your parents' approval over your marriage vows. So now you get to live with those choices while I live with mine. She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking slightly from the confrontation, but her resolve stronger than ever. The cracks were showing. David's confidence was wavering. His family's certainty was crumbling. The narrative they controlled was being rewritten in real time, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Over the next 2 weeks, Vanessa's presence became impossible to ignore. She appeared at a hospital fundraiser where she donated $250,000 and gave a brief speech about her mother's belief in accessible healthcare. She attended a gallery opening where her purchase of 3 paintings made the society pages. She joined a breakfast meeting for women entrepreneurs where she talked about inherited wealth and the responsibility to use it wisely. Each appearance generated buzz. Each photo generated questions. Each story generated doubt about the version of events David had been selling. His coworkers started treating him differently, with a mix of suspicion and pity that suggested they'd heard rumors he couldn't control. Claudia's social media posts about her pregnancy had slowed down, probably because people were starting to ask questions about why she never showed any visible signs of being 6 months along. The Reynolds family, who'd been so confident in their orchestrated divorce, were now the subjects of gossip, suggesting they'd massively miscalculated who Vanessa Lawson actually was. And through it all, Vanessa maintained her calm, her grace, her strategic patience. She documented every interaction, every attempted contact from David's family, every shift in public perception. She was building toward something specific, something that would crystallize all of this momentum into a single, devastating moment of revelation. The baby was due in 10 days. The gala was scheduled for 2 weeks after her due date, giving her time to recover enough to attend. Everything was aligned. Every piece was in place. Every person who'd betrayed her was about to learn what happened when you underestimated a woman with nothing to lose, everything to gain, and the resources to make sure justice wasn't just served, but delivered with precision that would leave them speechless. David had thought he was escaping a trap when he handed her those divorce papers. He'd actually walked right into one. And soon, very soon, it would snap shut around him, Claudia, and everyone who'd helped them. The reversal wasn't coming. It was already here. They just didn't know it yet. David couldn't sleep anymore. He'd lie awake at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling of his temporary apartment, replaying every conversation with Vanessa, every sighting his mother reported, every whisper he'd heard at work about his ex-wife's mysterious wealth. The woman he'd left sobbing at a graveside was now appearing in society pages, sitting on charity boards, and writing checks that made his entire annual salary look like pocket change. None of it made sense. He'd known Margaret Lawson for 2 years, visited her modest apartment dozens of times, attended family dinners where they'd split the bill at casual restaurants. She'd been kind, warm, but clearly not wealthy. So where did $500 million come from? Because that was the number circulating now in whispers, an impossible figure that kept growing with each retelling. Beside him, Claudia shifted in her sleep, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. 6 months pregnant, she claimed, but there was no bump, no weight gain, nothing except her word and a suspicious reluctance to let him attend any doctor's appointments. He'd been pushing harder lately, demanding to be included, and she'd been deflecting with increasingly transparent excuses. Her doctor was on vacation. The office had scheduling conflicts. She'd had a scare and needed privacy. Each excuse felt thinner than the last, and David was starting to see patterns he'd been willfully blind to before. The way she angled herself in photos to hide her stomach. The way she wore baggy clothes that should have been unnecessary at 6 months. The way she changed the subject whenever he asked specific questions about symptoms, cravings, or the baby's movement. He wanted to believe her, needed to believe her. Because if Claudia was lying, then everything he destroyed had been for nothing. His marriage, his reputation, his self-respect, all of it sacrificed for a woman who might be running the oldest con in history. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from his sister Rachel. "We need to talk about Vanessa. Tomorrow. Don't make excuses." David deleted it without responding, but the dread settled deeper in his stomach. His family had been pressuring him for weeks to handle the Vanessa situation, to figure out where her money came from, to ensure she wasn't entitled to anything from the Reynolds estate. As if he hadn't already tried. As if Vanessa was taking his calls or answering his questions. She'd become unreachable, operating in circles so far above him that he couldn't even get close enough to demand answers. The divorce papers still sat and signed, tied up in legal procedures his lawyer kept complaining about. "She's stalling," his attorney had said during their last meeting, using every technicality available. "It's like she wants to drag this out as long as possible. So take her to court. Force it through." David had been desperate, feeling control slip away. "We can try, but that means public proceedings. Discovery. She'd have the right to subpoena your financial records, communications, everything. Are you sure you want that level of scrutiny?" The lawyer had looked at him with an expression that suggested he knew exactly what skeletons might be hiding in David's closet. David had backed down, told his lawyer to keep trying negotiation. But the truth was becoming unavoidable. Vanessa held all the cards now, and she knew it. The next morning, David met his sister at a coffee shop downtown, arriving 15 minutes late because he'd been avoiding the conversation. Rachel was already seated, her laptop open, her expression tight with the kind of anger their family specialized in. "You're late." She didn't look up from her screen. Traffic. He slid into the chair across from her, ordering coffee he didn't want just to have something to do with his hands. "What's this about?" Rachel turned her laptop around, showing him a news article from the Atlanta Business Chronicle. The headline read, "Mystery Philanthropist. How Vanessa Lawson is Reshaping Atlanta's Charity Landscape." Below, it was a photo of Vanessa at some gala, looking radiant despite being 9 months pregnant, surrounded by people who mattered in ways the Reynolds family could only dream about. "This is what this is about," Rachel said, her voice sharp. "Your ex-wife is making us look like fools. People are asking questions, David. About why you divorced her. About what you knew. About whether our family pressured you into leaving a woman who was clearly connected to serious money." "I didn't know about any money," David said weakly. "Margaret never mentioned anything. Vanessa never mentioned anything. How was I supposed to know?" "You weren't supposed to know, because that's what they wanted. They played us. And you walked right into it." Rachel closed her laptop with more force than necessary. "Mom is losing her mind. The women at her club are talking. People she's been trying to impress for years are now more interested in meeting Vanessa than being seen with our family. Do you understand how humiliating this is? David wanted to point out that he'd been humiliated too, that finding out his wife's family had hidden wealth didn't exactly make him feel great, but he knew Rachel wouldn't care. His sister had never liked Vanessa anyway, had supported the divorce, had probably helped his parents orchestrate the whole thing. What do you want me to do about it? He asked. Figure out what her angle is. She's not just showing up at events for fun. She's building towards something. I can feel it. Rachel leaned forward, her voice dropping. And you need to lock down the situation with Claudia. Because if Vanessa exposes anything about how this divorce happened, about the affair, about the timing, we'll all go down with you. The mention of Claudia made David's stomach turn. What do you mean lock it down? I mean make sure her story is airtight. Make sure she's really pregnant. Make sure there's no way Vanessa can use this against us. Rachel's eyes were cold, calculating. Because I'm starting to hear rumors that Claudia might not be as pregnant as she claims. That's ridiculous. David's defense came out automatic, but hollow. Is it? Have you been to any appointments? Seen any ultrasounds? Heard a heartbeat? Rachel watched him closely. Or have you just been taking her word for it? The questions hung between them like accusations. And David realized his sister had identified the same doubts that had been keeping him awake at night. He left the coffee shop feeling worse than when he'd arrived, Rachel's warnings echoing in his head. Back at the apartment, he found Claudia on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her expression troubled. We need to talk, David said, standing in front of the TV so she couldn't avoid him. Claudia looked up, her face instantly arranging itself into concern. What's wrong, baby? I want to go to your next doctor's appointment. No excuses. No delays. I'm calling your doctor myself and scheduling it. Her face flickered, that micro-expression of panic he'd learned to recognize. David, I already told you. I don't care what you told me. His voice was harder now, months of doubt crystallizing into demand. Either we go together, or I'm going to start asking questions I should have asked a long time ago. Claudia stood up, her hand moving to her stomach in that practiced gesture she used whenever she needed to remind him why he'd left his wife. You don't trust me? After everything I've been through with you. I'm not saying I don't trust you. I'm saying I need to see proof. Real proof. Not photos. Not stories. Actual medical confirmation that you're pregnant with my child. The words felt like betrayal even as he said them, but they needed to be said. Claudia's eyes filled with tears, a response so quick it felt rehearsed. How can you even ask me that? Do you know how hurtful this is? I'm carrying your baby, and you're treating me like I'm some kind of liar. Then prove you're not. David's voice didn't soften. Take me to an appointment. Let me hear the heartbeat. Let me see the ultrasound with your name on it. If you're really pregnant, this should be easy. The silence that followed was thick, with everything neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Claudia's tears stopped as quickly as they'd started, her expression shifting into something harder, more calculating. Fine, she said finally. I'll schedule an appointment. But after this, I don't ever want to have this conversation again. Fine, David echoed, but he knew it wasn't fine. Nothing was fine. He destroyed his marriage for a woman who might be lying, abandoned his pregnant wife for a pregnancy that might not exist, and aligned himself with a narrative that was falling apart in real time. Meanwhile, Vanessa was thriving, building, planning, preparing for something that everyone could feel coming, but nobody could see clearly enough to stop. That night, David drove past Vanessa's new address, the estate he'd discovered through his mother's relentless digging. The gates were imposing, the property massive, the kind of place that announced wealth so clearly that driving past it felt like a punishment. Lights glowed in the windows, and he could see movement inside, could imagine Vanessa in there, safe and powerful, and so far beyond his reach now that it felt like she'd never been his at all. He thought about the woman he'd handed divorce papers to at a funeral, the way she'd looked at him, devastated and disbelieving. He'd felt powerful in that moment, in control, like he was making a brave choice to follow his happiness. Now, he felt like a fool, like a man who'd been played so completely that he'd never even seen the game being played. His phone buzzed. A text from Claudia. Doctor's appointment scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. Hope you're happy. He wasn't happy. He was terrified, because he was starting to realize that everything he thought he'd gained was an illusion, and everything he'd given up might have been the only real thing he'd ever had. The stakes weren't just escalating anymore. They were about to explode. And when they did, David Reynolds was going to be standing at ground zero, with nothing to shield him from the blast. Vanessa gave birth on a Thursday morning, 3 days past her due date, in a private suite at Piedmont Hospital that looked more like a luxury hotel than a medical facility. The labor lasted 7 hours, and through every contraction, every moment of pain that nearly broke her, she thought about her mother, about Margaret's strength, her planning, her absolute certainty that Vanessa could handle whatever life threw at her. When they finally placed her daughter in her arms, a tiny, perfect human with dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival to the entire floor, Vanessa felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about showing her child what it meant to fight back, to refuse to be broken, to turn betrayal into power. "What's her name?" the nurse asked, updating the birth certificate paperwork. "Margaret," Vanessa said without hesitation. "Margaret Sophia Lawson." She dropped Reynolds from her own name weeks ago, reclaiming her mother's legacy, and her daughter would carry that legacy forward. David wasn't there, hadn't even known she was in labor. She'd removed him from her emergency contacts, blocked his number from receiving notifications, erased him from the parts of her life that mattered. He'd find out eventually, probably through his mother's relentless social monitoring, but by then it would be old news. The flowers started arriving within hours. Arrangements from people Vanessa barely knew, but who wanted to be associated with her now that her wealth and influence were undeniable. Catherine Jo sent white roses with a card that read, "The strongest foundations are built during the storms. Rest now. The finale approaches." Marcus Chun sent a massive teddy bear and a donation to the Children's Hospital in baby Margaret's name. Even the mayor's office sent congratulations, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 3 months ago, when Vanessa was just another pregnant woman being abandoned by her husband. She stayed in the hospital for 2 days, recovering and adjusting to motherhood, while Catherine handled the details of the next phase. The gala was scheduled for 2 weeks out, timed perfectly to maximize impact, while giving Vanessa enough recovery time to attend. "Are you sure you want to do this so soon after giving birth?" Catherine had asked during a phone call the day after Margaret was born. "I'm sure," Vanessa had replied, watching her daughter sleep in the bassinet beside her bed. "If I wait too long, the momentum shifts. People move on. The story changes. We need to strike while everyone's still paying attention." Catherine had laughed, a sound of pure respect. "Your mother trained you well." The invitations had gone out 3 weeks prior, cream-colored cards with gold lettering announcing the inaugural gala for the Margaret Lawson Foundation. 500 of Atlanta's most influential people had been invited, carefully selected to ensure maximum impact. Business leaders, politicians, society figures, journalists, and buried in that list, like landmines waiting to explode, were David Reynolds, his parents, his sister, and Claudia Bennett. Catherine had argued against inviting them. Why give them warning? Why let them prepare? But Vanessa had been firm. "Because I want them there. I want them to see it happen in real time. I want them to understand what they lost, who they underestimated, and how completely they've been outplayed." The invitations had been delivered by courier, impossible to ignore, and according to Catherine's sources, the Reynolds family had spent hours debating whether to attend. They'd ultimately decided they had to, that staying away would look like weakness or guilt, that they needed to understand what Vanessa was planning so they could counter it. They had no idea there was no counter, no defense, no way out of what was coming. Vanessa came home from the hospital to an estate transformed by the team Catherine had hired. A night nurse to help with Margaret's feedings. A security system upgraded to ensure complete privacy. Fresh flowers in every room, not because they were necessary, but because they reminded her that she was no longer surviving. She was thriving. The first week home was a blur of sleepless nights and the sharp, overwhelming love that came with being responsible for another human life. But even exhausted, even adjusting to motherhood, Vanessa kept working. She reviewed the evidence files with James Morrison, making sure every document was airtight, every timeline clear, every piece of proof undeniable. She rehearsed her speech, the words her mother had helped her craft in those final letters. She coordinated with the media team Catherine had assembled, ensuring that the story would be controlled, distributed, and amplified exactly as needed. "You're going to break the internet," Catherine said during one of their planning sessions, scrolling through the final presentation on her tablet. "This isn't just about David and Claudia anymore. This is about every woman who's been underestimated, every person who's been betrayed by someone they trusted. This story is going to reach millions." "Good," Vanessa said, adjusting baby Margaret in her arms. "Let it reach millions. Let every person who thinks they can use someone and walk away without consequences see what happens when they're wrong." Friday arrived, the day of David's doctor's appointment with Claudia, and Vanessa knew about it because her private investigator had been tracking both of them for months. She considered interfering, exposing Claudia's lie before the gala, but decided against it. Let David discover the truth on his own terms. Let him sit with that revelation for a week, knowing he destroyed everything for nothing. Let it eat at him every day until the gala, when the public revelation would finish what his private discovery started. According to the investigator's report, received at 3:47 p.m. that Friday, David and Claudia never made it to the doctor's office. They'd had a fight in the parking lot, loud enough that other people had noticed, ending with Claudia storming off and David sitting in his car for 40 minutes before driving away. The investigator's notes included a description. Subject appeared distressed, repeatedly hitting steering wheel, possibly crying. Vanessa read the report twice, feeling no satisfaction, no joy, just the cold certainty that justice was unfolding exactly as it should. That weekend, David called 17 times from a new number she hadn't blocked yet. She let every call go to voicemail, listening to them later while Margaret slept. His voice deteriorated with each message, starting angry, shifting to desperate, ending at something close to begging. "Vanessa, please pick up. I know you don't owe me anything, but I need to talk to you. I need to understand what happened. What's happening? Please." She deleted them all. On Monday, 1 week before the gala, the Atlanta Business Chronicle published the interview Vanessa had given 2 weeks prior. The cover featured her photo, professional and powerful, with the headline, "From Grief to Grace: How Vanessa Lawson is Honoring Her Mother's Legacy." The article detailed her mother's hidden empire, the $500 million inheritance, and Vanessa's plans to use that wealth to support causes Margaret had cared about. It mentioned briefly and factually that Vanessa had recently divorced and given birth, framing her as a woman who'd overcome personal tragedy to emerge stronger. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with support, with women sharing their own stories of betrayal and resilience, with people praising Vanessa's grace and strength. Within hours, #Vanessa Lawson was trending, and the gala had become the most talked about event in Atlanta. Tickets that had been politely accepted weeks ago were now desperately desired by people who hadn't been invited. The venue had to add security to handle the increased media attention. David's name was mentioned in the article, just once, in a sentence that read, "Lawson finalized her divorce from David Reynolds shortly after her mother's passing, choosing to focus on her daughter and her philanthropic work." That single sentence generated thousands of comments speculating about what had happened, why the marriage had ended, whether David had known about the money. People started digging, finding the timeline, realizing that he'd divorced her right around her mother's funeral. The narrative David had tried so hard to control was being rewritten by people he'd never meet, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Wednesday arrived, for days before the gala, and Vanessa received a letter delivered by courier. The return address was David's apartment. Inside was a handwritten note on plain paper, his writing shaky and desperate. "Vanessa, I know I don't deserve your time or your forgiveness. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I'm begging you to let me see my daughter, to let me explain, to give me a chance to make this right. I was wrong about everything. Please, David." She read it once, then placed it in the evidence folder with all the others. Every text, every email, every moment of him realizing too late what he'd thrown away. It would all be part of the presentation, part of a story that showed not just what had been done to her, but how thoroughly the people who'd done it had come to regret it. Thursday, Catherine called with final confirmations. The venue is set. The evidence is loaded into the presentation. The media team is ready. Security is briefed. Your dress is being delivered tomorrow. Everything is in place. She paused. Are you ready for this? Vanessa looked around her mother's library, at the journals and notes that had guided her through the darkest months of her life, at her daughter sleeping peacefully in a bassinet nearby, at the life she'd built from the ashes of betrayal. I've been ready since the moment he handed me those papers at my mother's grave, she said quietly. This isn't revenge, Catherine. This is justice. And yes, I'm ready. Friday morning, the day before the gala, Vanessa woke early and stood in front of her mirror, studying the woman looking back at her. 3 months ago, she'd been broken, humiliated, abandoned at the lowest point of her life. Now she stood in a home worth millions, with a daughter who would never doubt her worth, and the power to make sure the people who tried to destroy her would spend years regretting that choice. Tomorrow night, everyone would see what happened when you underestimated a Lawson woman. Tomorrow night, the trap that had been set since the moment David handed her those papers would finally spring shut. Tomorrow night, poetic justice would be served, and Vanessa would be there, calm and composed, to watch it all unfold exactly as her mother had planned. The grand ballroom at the Four Seasons gleamed like something out of a dream. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables dressed in white and gold, flower arrangements that cost more than most weddings, and 500 of Atlanta's most powerful people dressed in their finest, all gathered under the banner of the Margaret Lawson Foundation. Vanessa arrived precisely on time, not early to show eagerness, not late to create drama, but exactly when the invitation stated, making an entrance that stopped conversations mid-sentence. Her dress was midnight blue, elegant without being flashy, fitted perfectly despite having given birth 3 weeks ago, and she moved through the room with a kind of confidence that made people step aside without realizing they were doing it. Baby Margaret was at home with the night nurse, safe and far from what was about to unfold, but Vanessa carried her presence like armor, a reminder of what she was fighting for and who she'd become. David was already there. She spotted him immediately, standing near the bar with Claudia, who looked uncomfortable in a dress that tried too hard to hide what wasn't there. His parents flanked them like bodyguards, Linda's face tight with the kind of tension that came from knowing something bad was coming, but not knowing what. They'd dressed for battle in designer labels and forced smiles, probably thinking their presence alone would intimidate Vanessa into softening whatever she had planned. They had no idea that their attendance was exactly what she wanted, that every moment of discomfort they felt right now was just the opening act. Marcus Chen approached first, embracing her warmly. This is incredible, Vanessa. Your mother would be so proud. She planned most of it, Vanessa replied truthfully. I'm just executing her vision. Around them, guests mingled and admired the presentation boards showcasing the foundation's planned initiatives, the causes Margaret had cared about, the impact $50 million could make in the right hands. It all looked legitimate because it was legitimate. This wasn't a fake charity created for revenge. This was real work that would continue long after tonight, a genuine legacy that made what was about to happen even more powerful. Catherine appeared at her elbow, speaking low. They're all here. David, Claudia, the entire Reynolds family. The media team is in position. We're ready when you are. Vanessa nodded, her heart rate steady despite the magnitude of what was coming. Give me 15 minutes to greet guests, then we'll begin. She worked the room like she'd been doing this her entire life, thanking donors, introducing herself to people she'd only met once, making everyone feel seen and appreciated. She was careful to avoid David's side of the room, not out of fear, but strategy, letting the anticipation build, letting him wonder when she'd acknowledge him, if she'd acknowledge him. When she finally did make eye contact across the ballroom, his face went pale. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, her expression neutral, then turned away to continue greeting guests as if he were nobody. Just another face in a crowd of people who didn't matter. The dinner service began at 7, courses arriving with precision timing, wine flowing freely, conversations buzzing with the kind of energy that came from powerful people gathered in beautiful spaces. Vanessa ate little, her stomach tight with anticipation, but she maintained perfect composure, laughing at appropriate moments, engaging with her table guests, playing the role of gracious host while inside her mind counted down the minutes until everything changed. At 8:30, the lights dimmed slightly, and Catherine took the stage, welcoming everyone and explaining the Foundation's mission. Her speech was polished and moving, talking about Margaret Lawson's quiet generosity, her belief in giving back, her dedication to making the world better. Vanessa watched the audience, saw them nodding along, saw David shifting uncomfortably in his seat, probably wondering when this would end so he could leave. Then Catherine said the words that made the room go silent. And now I'd like to invite Margaret's daughter, Vanessa Lawson, to share some words about her mother's legacy and the journey that brought us here tonight. Vanessa stood, smoothing her dress, and walked to the stage with measured steps that betrayed none of the adrenaline flooding her system. Behind her, a screen descended from the ceiling, large enough for everyone in the ballroom to see clearly. She reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at 500 faces, all focused on her. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady and clear. 3 months ago, I buried my mother at Oakland Cemetery. It was the worst day of my life. Not just because I lost the woman who raised me, who taught me everything I know about strength and dignity, but because it was also the day my husband chose to end our marriage. The room went completely silent. People leaned forward. David's face drained of color. He handed me divorce papers at her graveside, in front of everyone, while they were lowering her casket into the ground. I was 7 months pregnant with his child. My mother had just died, and he chose that moment to walk away. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads turned toward David's table. Linda Reynolds looked like she might faint. Vanessa continued, her voice never wavering. I share this not for sympathy, but for context. Because what happened next is a story about underestimation, about people who mistake kindness for weakness, about the danger of assuming you know someone's worth. She clicked a button, and the screen behind her lit up with a photo of Margaret Lawson, professional and confident, nothing like the modest woman most people had assumed she was. My mother spent 30 years building a fortune that nobody knew about. $500 million across investments, real estate, and business ventures. She lived modestly, worked quietly, and let everyone underestimate her because she understood something profound. The best protection is invisibility until you're ready to be seen. The numbers on the screen made people gasp. Property deeds, investment statements, business holdings, all documented, all real, all proof that Margaret Lawson had been playing a different game than anyone realized. She left it all to me, Vanessa said. Every dollar, every property, every carefully planned investment. And she left me something else too. Instructions, guidance, a roadmap for what to do if I was ever betrayed. Click. The screen changed to show text messages between David and Claudia, time-stamped 9 months before the funeral. Intimate messages. Plans to be together. Discussions about how to end his marriage. The affair laid bare for everyone to see. My husband didn't leave me spontaneously, Vanessa continued as shocked murmurs filled the room. He was groomed to leave me by a woman who saw opportunity. A woman who worked with him, who targeted him deliberately, and who told him she was pregnant to ensure he wouldn't change his mind. Click. The screen showed Claudia's text to a friend, the one the investigator had obtained, where she admitted the pregnancy was fake, called it her insurance policy, and laughed about how easy David had been to manipulate. The ballroom erupted. People turned to stare at Claudia, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. David stood up, his chair scraping loudly, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. "Sit down, David," Vanessa said calmly into the microphone. "I'm not finished." He sat, probably because standing felt more exposed than sitting, probably because his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. But it wasn't just Claudia, Vanessa continued, her tone never becoming vindictive, just factual, just devastating. My former in-laws orchestrated this divorce. They pressured my husband to leave me, convinced him I was a burden, and even paid Claudia $10,000 3 weeks before my mother's funeral. Click. Bank records appeared, showing the transfer from Linda Reynolds to Claudia Bennett, the date and amount highlighted. Linda stood this time, her voice shaking with rage or fear or both. This is slander. This is a setup. It's documentation, Vanessa replied evenly. Every piece of evidence you're seeing has been verified by lawyers and investigators. It's all real. It's all true. And it's all legal to share because you all chose to make my private pain a public spectacle. She let that sink in before continuing. My mother knew this was coming. She died knowing my husband was cheating, knowing his family was plotting against me, knowing I'd be vulnerable and alone. So she left me the tools to fight back. Not with anger or revenge, but with the truth, with proof, with the kind of justice that comes from simply showing people who someone really is. The screen changed again, showing David's desperate voicemails from the past week, transcribed and timestamped. His messages about realizing his mistake, about wanting to see his daughter, about begging for another chance. These messages came after he discovered Claudia wasn't pregnant, Vanessa explained. After his perfect new life started crumbling. After he realized what he'd actually given up. But here's the thing about consequences. They don't care about regret. They don't care about apologies. They exist to teach lessons to people who thought they were above being taught. She paused, scanning the room, seeing the mix of shock, horror, and respect on faces throughout the ballroom. Tonight isn't about destroying anyone. It's about honoring my mother by showing what she taught me. That you don't need to scream to be heard. You don't need to fight dirty to win. You just need to be patient, be strategic, and trust that the truth, when revealed at the right moment, is the most powerful weapon that exists. Vanessa stepped back from the podium, and the screen behind her changed one final time, showing photos of baby Margaret, of Vanessa with her daughter, of a future being built without the people who tried to destroy her. The Margaret Lawson Foundation will support women leaving abusive situations, children who need advocates, and anyone who's been told they're not enough. Because my mother taught me that real power isn't about money. It's about using whatever you have to make sure the people who come after you don't have to suffer the way you did. She left the stage to stunned silence that erupted into applause, people standing, some crying, everyone understanding they'd just witnessed something unprecedented. David sat frozen at his table. Claudia had fled toward the exit, and the Reynolds family looked like they'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Vanessa walked calmly back to her seat, sat down, and took a sip of water. It was done. The truth was out, and there was nothing any of them could do to take it back. The ballroom remained electric with tension even after Vanessa returned to her seat, people processing what they'd just witnessed. Minds racing to understand how completely the narrative had been rewritten in 15 minutes. David sat at his table like statue, his face drained of all color, staring at nothing while around him the Reynolds family frantically whispered among themselves, probably trying to figure out damage control for something that was far beyond control. Claudia had disappeared completely, last seen pushing through the exit doors toward the parking garage. Her fake pregnancy and real manipulation exposed to everyone who mattered in Atlanta's social circles. The journalists present were already typing on their phones, knowing the story would dominate headlines by morning, that the documentation Vanessa had displayed made it bulletproof against libel claims, that this was the kind of scandal that would be studied in PR classes as a masterclass in strategic revelation. Catherine appeared beside Vanessa, placing a hand on her shoulder. The live stream reached 47,000 viewers before we cut it off. The foundation's website crashed from traffic. Your phone is going to explode when you turn it back on. Vanessa had silenced her phone before the speech, knowing the flood of messages would be overwhelming, choosing instead to stay present in this moment, to witness the fallout in real time. How do you feel? Catherine asked quietly. Vanessa considered the question carefully. She didn't feel triumphant or victorious in the way people might expect. She felt relieved, validated, like a weight she'd been carrying since that funeral had finally been lifted, replaced by the certainty that she'd honored her mother's legacy exactly as intended. "I feel like I can breathe again," she said finally. "Like I don't have to pretend anymore. Like everyone finally sees what actually happened instead of the story David tried to sell." Across the room, Linda Reynolds stood abruptly, grabbing her purse and coat, clearly intent on leaving before things got worse. But Marcus Chun, seated strategically nearby, stood to block her path, his voice carrying just loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. "Leaving so soon, Linda? I thought you'd want to celebrate the foundation. After all, your family did contribute to its necessity." The comment was surgical, polite enough to maintain plausible deniability, but sharp enough to draw blood. Linda's face went red, her mouth opening and closing without sound, before she simply pushed past him and headed for the exit, her husband Robert following silently behind her, looking 20 years older than he had at the start of the evening. Their departure triggered a cascade, other people at their table making excuses and leaving, not wanting to be associated with a scandal this public, this documented, this impossible to defend. David remained seated, alone now, staring at the table where his wine glass sat untouched. Vanessa watched him from across the room, feeling no satisfaction in his destruction, just the cold certainty that consequences had arrived exactly as they should. After several minutes, he stood and walked toward her table, moving through the crowd like a ghost, and Vanessa knew this confrontation was inevitable. She could have avoided it, could have had security escort him out, but she chose to face him one last time, to close this chapter completely. He stopped 3 feet from her table, his hands shaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk? Somewhere private." Vanessa looked up at him, this man she'd once loved, who'd once held her while she cried about her mother's declining health, who'd promised her forever and delivered betrayal instead. "There's nothing private left to say, David. You made sure of that when you handed me divorce papers at a funeral. I know. I know what I did. I know I can't fix it." His voice cracked. "But please, just 5 minutes. Let me explain." "Explain what?" Vanessa's tone was calm but firm. "How you chose to believe a woman you barely knew over your wife. How you let your parents manipulate you into abandoning your pregnant wife at her mother's funeral. How you realized Claudia was lying and suddenly wanted to come back." David flinched at each point like they were physical blows. "I was stupid. I was selfish. I believed what I wanted to believe because it was easier than facing the truth about my family, about Claudia, about myself." "You're right," Vanessa said simply. "You were all of those things. And now you get to live with the consequences of being all of those things." She stood, bringing herself to eye level with him, her voice dropping lower so only he could hear. "You thought my mother was a simple bookkeeper. You thought I was weak because I was kind. You thought you could walk away without repercussions because you saw what you wanted to see instead of what was actually there. That's not my fault, David. That's yours. I want to meet my daughter." His voice turned desperate, grasping at the only card he had left. "I have rights. I'm her father." "You have the rights that a court decides you have," Vanessa replied evenly. "And given that you abandoned her mother while pregnant, given that you chose your mistress over your child, given that everything you've done for the past 3 months has been documented and is now public record, I suspect those rights will be extremely limited. But we can let the lawyers figure that out." She picked up her purse, signaling the conversation was over. "My daughter's name is Margaret, by the way, after my mother, the woman whose funeral you used as the stage for your betrayal. I thought you should know that she'll grow up hearing stories about her grandmother's strength, her intelligence, and her ability to protect the people she loved even after death. She'll never hear stories about you unless she asks, and if she asks, I'll tell her the truth. That her father made choices that hurt people, and that choices have consequences." David's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Vanessa saw the man she'd once married, vulnerable and lost and drowning in regret. But that man had made his choices, and those choices had led here, to a ballroom full of people who now knew exactly who he was. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Vanessa." "I know you are," she replied. "But sorry doesn't undo what you did. Sorry doesn't erase standing at my mother's grave and handing me divorce papers. Sorry doesn't change the fact that you chose cruelty when you could have chosen kindness. So, yes, you're sorry. But that's your problem now, not mine. She walked away, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the ballroom. And she didn't look back. Catherine was waiting near the exit with her coat and security detail. Ready to go home? More than ready, Vanessa replied, feeling the exhaustion of the evening settling into her bones, but also the satisfaction of a job completed exactly as planned. The drive home was quiet, Atlanta's lights blurring past the car windows, while Vanessa processed everything that had happened. Her phone, when she finally turned it on, showed 347 text messages, 89 missed calls, and notifications that her social media mentions had exceeded the app's ability to count. She'd become, in a single evening, one of the most talked about people in Atlanta, and by morning, probably one of the most talked about people in the country. Catherine had been right. The story was bigger than David and Claudia now. It had become a symbol, a representation of every person who'd been underestimated, betrayed, or told they weren't enough. The comments pouring in weren't just about schadenfreude, though there was plenty of that. They were from women sharing their own stories of divorce and survival, from people praising Margaret's foresight, from mothers teaching their daughters about the importance of financial independence and strategic thinking. At home, baby Margaret was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that her mother had just rewritten their family's narrative on a stage in front of Atlanta's elite. Vanessa stood over her daughter's crib, watching the steady rise and fall of her tiny chest, and felt tears finally come. Not tears of sadness or anger, but release. Relief. The certainty that she'd done what needed to be done, that her daughter would grow up in a world where the truth had been told and justice had been served. Your grandmother would be so proud, Vanessa whispered, touching Margaret's soft hair. She built all of this for us, for moments like tonight, so you'd never have to question your worth or your power. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake, and Vanessa stepped back, letting her sleep, knowing that the story of tonight would be told and retold, that Margaret would grow up hearing about the night her mother turned betrayal into triumph. The next morning, the headlines were exactly what Catherine had predicted. Atlanta heiress exposes ex-husband's betrayal in stunning gala reveal. The $500 million divorce. How one woman turned grief into power. Justice served. Vanessa Lawson's perfect revenge. The articles included photos from the gala, quotes from attendees, and analysis of the strategic brilliance behind the revelation. Legal experts weighed in on the divorce implications. Business journalists examined Margaret's investment strategies. Social commentators discussed the broader meaning of a story where patience and preparation defeated manipulation and cruelty. David's employer released a statement, saying he'd been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. Claudia had deleted all her social media accounts. The Reynolds family issued a terse no comment through their lawyer, but Linda's country club friends were already distancing themselves, canceling lunch dates, removing tags from old photos. Vanessa read the coverage while nursing Margaret, seeing her story reflected back through 1,000 different lenses, each one validating what she'd known all along, that she'd been wronged, that her response had been justified, that her mother's planning had been nothing short of genius. A text from James Morrison appeared mid-morning. David's lawyer called. He's willing to agree to any custody arrangement you propose. No court fight. No demands. Complete surrender. Congratulations, Vanessa. You won. She stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. I didn't win. I just made sure the truth came out. There's a difference. But even as she sent it, she knew that distinction didn't matter to anyone but her. To the rest of the world, this was a victory, a triumph, a perfect example of poetic justice delivered with devastating precision. 3 months later, Vanessa stood in her mother's library, now converted into an office where she managed the foundation's growing operations. The Margaret Lawson Foundation had received over $30 million in additional donations since the gala, money from people inspired by the story, wanting to be part of something that represented resilience and strategic justice. They'd opened 2 women's shelters, funded 3 education programs, and partnered with hospitals to provide support for single mothers. The work was real, meaningful, exactly what her mother would have wanted. David had signed away most of his parental rights in exchange for supervised visits twice a month, visits he rarely used because facing Vanessa, facing his daughter, facing the consequences of his choices was apparently more than he could handle consistently. Claudia had left Atlanta entirely, moving to another state where nobody knew her story, though the internet made true anonymity impossible. The Reynolds family had retreated from public life, their social standing permanently damaged by their role in the scandal. Vanessa's life had settled into a new normal, one where she was simultaneously a mother, a philanthropist, a businesswoman, and a symbol of what it meant to fight back strategically. She'd been asked to speak at conferences, write a book, share her story with audiences who saw her as inspiration. She declined most of it, preferring to focus on Margaret, on the foundation, on building the future her mother had envisioned. But she'd agreed to one interview with a journalist who'd covered the story fairly and thoroughly, wanting to set the record straight one final time. "Do you have any regrets?" the journalist had asked. Vanessa had thought carefully before answering. "I regret that it had to happen this way. I regret that my mother isn't here to see her granddaughter. I regret that my daughter won't have the traditional family I'd hoped to give her. But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret exposing the truth. And I don't regret showing people that underestimating someone is one of the most dangerous mistakes you can make." The interview would be published next week, and Vanessa knew it would generate another wave of attention, more discussions about justice and revenge and the line between them. But she was ready for it now, comfortable in her role, confident in her choices, certain that her mother's legacy was being honored exactly as it should be. Baby Margaret, now 6 months old, was starting to smile and laugh, reaching for the world with tiny hands that didn't yet understand how much power they'd inherit. Vanessa watched her daughter play on the floor, surrounded by toys that cost what most families spent on rent, growing up in a mansion built by a grandmother she'd never met, and felt the weight of responsibility settle comfortably on her shoulders. This was her life now, not the one she'd planned, but the one she'd built from the ruins of betrayal. And it was good. It was powerful. It was exactly what happened when you underestimated a loss in woman and lived long enough to regret it.